Hello, you're watching TVP World Talks. I'm Ina Shravinsky. Following the NATO summit in Ankara, Europe has reaffirmed its commitment to spend more on defense. But can these ambitious goals be met fast enough to counter the Russian threat? With Germany trying to reassert its role as a pivotal part of the regional security architecture despite persistent difficulties, Central Europe emerging as the new linchpin of NATO military power, and the constant tensions over Washington's demands for greater spending, how NATO is going to go about implementing its latest strategy. That is the crucial question here. And joining us here to discuss this is Roland Freudenstein, co-founder of Brussels Freedom Hub. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good morning and thanks for having me.
Right, so first of all, do you think that this summit was a success? Former US ambassador to NATO, Ivo Dalde, recently wrote that he was disappointed. He thought that this was a wasted opportunity and that a bolder strategy was something that he expected but didn't get. Do you agree with this assessment?
Well, it certainly could have been better, but it could have been a lot worse. And I think in that sense, if we compare the result to the fears that were prevalent in Europe before the summit, then this was a limited success.
So there is still a degree of conditionality hanging over this. We had Donald Trump repeating his demands concerning Greenland, criticizing certain allies. To what extent do you think these reassurances are going to be lasting in nature? Will Europe be able to satisfy all those demands regarding spending?
Yes, at least some of the European powers are absolutely serious about strategically improving their defense spending. Germany is one of them. Poland and the Baltic countries and the Nordics are already there. I think the problem is more with the southern and western members. We have Britain, for example, which is in such economic and financial trouble that this 5% goal that was already decided last year in The Hague at the NATO summit will be extremely difficult to match. France is not in a much better position financially. And then you have some so-called laggard countries such as Spain, which openly refuses to commit to the goal, the only NATO member state. But there are others whose assurances are not very credible that they will actually go to the agreed levels by 2035, which is the goal for the 5% of the GDP. So altogether, it's a mixed picture. And but if the major powers, especially Germany, stick to their commitments, I think Europe will already have made a strategic step forward.
So before we move on to Germany, because there are some interesting news there as well, regarding countries which are not spending enough, do you think that this is simply a function of democracy, i.e. greater spending for the military would be toxic for the current governments? At least this is the way they perceive this. They're afraid that they would lose elections. But is this enough of an excuse? I mean, sometimes you simply demand bold and crucial decisions to be made by your leaders, regardless of the consequences. And arguably, this is a moment in history where such decisions would be rather useful, to say the least.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're facing another cannons versus butter moment where governments really have to get their priorities right. And some governments are obviously afraid to make the necessary cuts, for example, in social security, in different civilian sectors of state spending. So yes, you're right that leadership would be in demand here, but some governments just don't feel that they're in the position to follow up on that principle. And they really are afraid of their populist and often right-wing extremist oppositions.
And isn't that also something of a culture clash? I mean, in the US, they are not really big on social spending. And people like Donald Trump find it very difficult to understand why should they spend more in order for European countries to engage in a type of spending that Americans are not really actually doing on an everyday basis anyway.
Well, I mean, if there is a culture difference, of course. But it's not like the US has spent less on social welfare because they want to protect the Europeans from the Russians or something like that. But Americans have a different understanding of the state's role in the economy and in securing individual welfare. Europeans have another different understanding. So I don't think it's easy. It's actually fair to say the US have financed Europe's welfare system over decades. The United States had concrete benefits from being the hegemon of the free world. I mean, starting with jobs in the arms industry because everybody bought American weapons. Some still are buying American weapons, and not to mention all the advantages of having the world's lead currency, of being able to control trade flows and so on. So there are all kinds of strategic advantages that the US had and still has. Because of its leading role in Western security. So I think just to say Americans suffer because Europeans can rest on their rich social benefits would be really, really simplifying things.
So now, what certainly is not suffering is the US defense industry. There are more and more countries buying American weapons, but there are problems with supplies. Now, let's take a look briefly at what Poland's Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski had to say on the subject.
Americans realize that they must accelerate technology transfer and enter into joint ventures in Europe so that part of American equipment is produced where it is most needed today.
So do you think that this is a good option, given problems with supply, problems which have been exacerbated by the conflict in the Middle East, which is showing no signs of abating, by the way? There have been news of the American company Endural entering into a deal to produce missiles in Poland, potentially also Patriot missiles being manufactured in Ukraine. What do you make of that? Would this be the solution to at least some of the problems which have plagued NATO recently?
Yes, that's part of the solution, is to make American weapon systems in license in countries such as Poland, Ukraine, and others. But I think the other part of that formula has to be that Europe builds up its own defense industry with its own weapon systems, with its own research and development, production lines, and so on. And here's where we have a very strong double bind, as psychologists like to call it, from America. The Americans want Europeans to independently take care of their own security, but they still want them to buy American weapons. And that doesn't work, not the way that Trump and the people around him imagine it. But as I said, licensed production of American systems is probably a solution to part of those questions and problems.
So do you think another option would be to simplify the entire framework for procurement? Because some critics are saying, well, NATO is really lagging behind when it comes to the way in which weapons are procured, in which technology is actually making its way, if not to the front line, then at least into military warehouses. Do you think adopting an approach similar to Ukraine, which created its Brave One system, essentially a platform which allows innovative companies to bid for military contracts on a competitive basis, could this be a solution to at least a part of what has been a major bottleneck for European countries?
I mean, there are so many aspects of Ukraine's successful defense and Ukraine's defense industry progress that we should look at and that we can learn from in Western Europe and Central Europe. So I think we should take Ukraine as an example in this case. And in many other cases, our arms industry in European countries is way too state-centered, way too top-heavy, and structurally conservative, and we have to become more flexible. I think there is some light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, if you look at this German city of Munich emerging as a cluster in startups ranging from drones to hypersonic missiles to other military technology, that's the way forward. And in this case, again, Ukraine has been showing the way in how to quickly develop and produce weapon systems such as drones, for example. Whereas, the giants of German and other European defense industry, Rheinmetall, for example, in Germany, I mean, these are very, like a tanker, these are gigantic ships which are very difficult to maneuver. And I think we need to become much more flexible, and Ukraine is showing us the way.
And Germany, of course, is making efforts of its own, including recent news of a deal with the US to purchase Tomahawk missiles, which had been intended to be stationed by US forces, later on withdrawn. So now Germany wants to fill the gap in that way. That perhaps might be the subject for another conversation in the near future. In the meantime, Roland Freudenstein was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thanks for having me.
And I'm Jan You're watching TVP World. Please stay with us for more latest news, updates and commentary.